All right. We continue our study in First Peter this morning, and we have talked about the hope that we are um, working towards, a home in heaven, that mansion over the hilltop we just sang about, the place God's preparing for us, a place that He promises to us as His children, and a place that we know will be infinitely better than anything that we have here. And Peter has been writing to the Christians of his day who are scattered around in a world that is vastly different from what they're trying to be, who they're trying to live like, and is encouraging them to continue with the struggle of that, not to give up. And they dealt with the same things that we still face today, struggling how to approach life and life's issues. And as Christians, we seem to find ourselves always looking for this way to balance between life as a Christian and life living within this world. And that really does become a struggle so often. And I think maybe part of it is kind of get our focus and our thinking backwards or mixed around on some of it. And so Peter is addressing a group of people that have the same struggle, that have some of the same problems that we do. So we pick up this morning, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. And we'll start with verses 11 and 12, where he says, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires, which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us." As Peter writes this, he begins, as I describe it, by addressing citizenship. This is a group of people who are scattered through the world. Their citizenship is probably the most upside down, twisted around thing in the world. Most of them were Jews. And yet, as Jews, they were part of the group that's been living in exile since God sent them into Babylon and Assyria as slaves for their disobedience. They've seen several different countries all the way till the time of Rome now taking over and continuing this enslavement. And even though maybe they had been able to go back home to Israel, they were still, in essence, slaves of the Roman government. And then as Christ came and as this particular group, learned of Him, became Christians, they found themselves once again scattered because of persecution. And so when He talks to them about being foreigners and exiles, those were two terms that hit home to them. They could relate to living somewhere other than your home country. They could relate to still identifying with a country, but I've been kicked out of that area. I can't be there for political reasons, whatever. And so they could grasp that concept. But Peter's addressing it not as Jews living somewhere other than Israel. He's addressing it as Christians living somewhere other than heaven. And that application still applies to us. We're Christians. Our citizenship, the one that matters, the one that needs to be focused on, is I am a citizen of heaven who happens to be currently living in the United States of America. Unfortunately, we tend to reverse that. I'm an American who happens to be a Christian. That's more the mindset we typically have, isn't it? I'm an American, but I just happen to be a Christian. No. We've got that reversed around. First and foremost, I am to be a citizen of heaven, a citizen of God's kingdom. And I happen to be living in America. Some of his citizens happen to be living in Russia, some of them in Africa, some of them in China, where it's very hostile against Christians. And so everybody's facing all of these struggles. But what happens when we reverse that, when we start, I'm an American who happens to be Christian, we start getting bogged down in the things of being an American. We've seen a lot of that lately with the last election. We get so bogged down in the politics of who's going to be our elected officials and who's going to be in charge of what and who's doing this and who's doing that. And do I have a role to play in that as a Christian? Yeah, because I happen to live here and I've got some laws that allow me to have some say in that. But is that my first priority? My first priority is to live as a citizen of the kingdom of heaven. That, to some people, that may seem like a subtle difference of how you order that. But in reality, it's a pretty big difference. By stating I'm a Christian first, it defines all the laws that I'm subject to. First and foremost, the first laws that I answer to are the laws of God. In terms of the world, when you live in America, that's the first laws that you answer to. If we leave here and go to another country, yes, we're subject to their laws, but we still can't break any laws. Even if they allow something there, we can't break any of the laws that our country says we can't do even when abroad. When their citizens come over here or their government officials come over here, there are things that they can do and can't do based on the laws of their country. Things that our country might allow them to do that might not allow us to do because they're from somewhere else. Well, that's the same type of thing I'm talking about. I'm from heaven. That's my citizenship. And so the laws of God dictate my life first and foremost. There are things that our country might allow that God doesn't, obviously. Yet God also tells me I have to subject myself to the laws of the land, unless there's a conflict. When the laws of the land conflict with the laws of God, my default is not American law, my default is God's law. And part of the problem that we have is when I get so bogged down in living as an American, living within a country or whatever it may be, and I get so bogged down in the politics, so bogged down in the minutia of everyday life of living as a Christian, sometimes I forget to check things against God's law. I just get into the flow of things. And I start forgetting who I really am supposed to be. Peter says, live like you're a foreigner or an exile. That's not, you're not American, you're Christian. Live as somebody who knows where your true home is. In living as a Christian, he says, abstain from sinful desires. In doing so, he's defining what he talks about in verse 12. Verse 12, he says, live such good lives among the pagans. Good lives according to who? Good lives according to God, not the pagans. Those outside of God, they have a totally different definition of what is a good life, don't they? It's judged by how much money do you have, how much property do you have, how much fame do you have, how much power and influence do you have. All these other factors that they judge whether you've got a good life or not. Those aren't necessarily the standards that we use as a Christian of whether we've got a good life or not. How much love do I have? How much forgiveness from God do I have? How many blessings is God pouring out upon me? How much strength has he provided me in the moments when things don't go right? How well do I hold up and walk through the difficult moments? Because there are people who have, in essence, all the money in the world. Still can't get through a problem when a problem hits. Because everything's based on the wrong things. So Peter says, live as a Christian, not as a member of the world, a Christian who happens to be living in the world. Abstain from those things that the world pushes at you, that it declares make a good life, and instead live a good life according to God. I want you to notice, though, in that passage, that though you're living a good life, though you're doing things right in accordance with God, what are the pagans going to do? Going to accuse you. They're going to say, look how dumb that person is for believing that. Look how stupid they are for following this, for giving up this opportunity, for, they're going to try everything they can to accuse us of wrong, to accuse us of being false in what we're doing, false in our motives. Peter says, just know that they're going to do that. But live right anyway. Because there's going to be a moment when they will stand before God. This is a little bit along the lines of what we were talking about in Bible class with our forgiving people and them still standing before God. There will come that moment when every individual will stand before God. Peter says, live your life in such a way, live such good lives that though they accuse you now of wrongdoing, when they stand before God, they will have no choice but to glorify God because of your action. When they stand before God, there will no longer be any doubt about whether he exists or not. Big Bang theories will be out the window. Big E evolution will be out the window. All of the ideals, all of the rules that they live by, all of the things that they thought they knew as they forgot their knowledge of God. Paul talks about Romans 1. All of those things will be dealt with when they stand before God. But what Peter's saying is, while we're living among them, while we have this moment, it needs to be lived in such a way that when they stand before God, they're going to say, you know, I saw Dan living that way. He tried to warn me. He tried to tell me, and I accused him of all sorts of things. But now, God, I've got to admit, Dan told me right. Dan lived it right in front of me. That glorifies God. Because Dan lived according to God's rules. How bad will it be? Not just for them, but for us, if they are able to stand before God and say, well, you know, that Daniel, he preached down there at the church. He made all these claims, but, you know, I saw how he really lived. He didn't back it up, God. That's why I didn't worry about it. I become an excuse for people before God, rather than being that which showed them, proved what God had said. We don't want that to be the case for us. We want to be that which brings glory to God. So then Peter continues, verse 13. 1 Peter 2, verse 13. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong, or to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. There are a lot of Christians struggling with this issue right now. There are a lot of Christians who didn't vote for the man that's now in the White House, who don't feel like that the one they did vote for was respected, and so I'm not going to respect theirs. We've got all these issues going on in our country we happen to live in. Peter reminds us governments are there by God. Same thing Paul talked about in Romans chapter 13, the first 7 verses. God established governments. He causes them to rise, he causes them to fall. It was true in the Old Testament, whether he was raising up Babylon to come take over Israel because of their sin, or whether he raised up the Assyrians to come in and take over the Babylonians, or the Roman Empire, or whether it was raising Israel back up, whether it was raising the United States up at a time, provide a place of freedom of worship. May come a day when he tears this place down. The one kingdom that will stand forever. Kingdom of God. That's where our citizenship. God says, submit yourselves for his sake, so that the world can't talk bad about God. Submit yourself to those authorities. Now, the fact that God puts governments in place doesn't mean that everyone that he puts in place or allows to be in place is a good leader, a good ruler. If it did, you'd have a hard time explaining how Hitler came to power. A lot of other rulers, for that matter. You'd have a hard time even looking through the Old Testament and seeing some of the kings of Israel, how they came to be kings of Israel, God's people. But what we see is that time after time, God takes care of the big picture for his eternal kingdom, his people. And he utilizes the rest of his creation, whether it is acting in good or acting in evil, and he utilizes it to accomplish what he needs in the big picture for his kingdom. For what's best for it. And so, in the time that we live in, we have to live under the rule of what's in place. Now, the more of us that are living under God's rule, the more likely the government that we're living under is a government that we don't mind living under. And that goes the other way. When there's less of us living under God's rule, more likely we get a government that we're less happy with, less wanting to live under. Neither Peter nor Paul, either one, distinguish between the two. Just say live under it. Live within its rules. Now, in our country, we have rules that allow us to vote, to try to change who's in the government and all that. And we, as Christians, we can live within that. We can vote, we can do those things. But he says, show proper respect. Why? Because first and foremost, I am a citizen of the kingdom of God. I am a Christian that God has given a set of standards of how to live, how to love, how to forgive, how to have compassion, how to act that don't change with the governments of this world. And if I live according to God's laws in those ways, then I honor God. And God will ultimately silence the talk of those that oppose him. And go back and look at Old Testament example. You look at the book of Daniel, you'll see a time when God's people had drifted from him. That is, the nation of Israel. And that's not to say that every person in Israel had drifted from God, had they? Yet it was bad enough. God sends in Babylon to take them over. In Daniel chapter 1, we're introduced to 4 young men. Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. They were called by the Babylonians. Verse 8 of chapter 1 says, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. See, they had selected these young men to train up for roles within their government, even though they were slaves, outsiders. It was part of how they were going to rule the people. So they selected these young men, and the king said, because they're going to be part of my government, they get access to the better stuff, food, the wine, all of that. That was meat sacrificed to idols. It was wine and other things that all came out of the pagan worship. And Daniel says, I may be living in your country. I may have to live under your government. I may even end up being a part of your government. But I am still God's child. His first. I can't defile myself with these things. Please allow me to eat just this so that I can serve you but still serve my God. They allowed it. God blessed them through that. The rest of the book of Daniel shows those 4 young men living as godly citizens in an ungodly world. That is what God is calling us to do. What Peter was encouraging them to do. Live as a foreigner, live as an exile, live as a Christian in the midst of a lost world. Let everything that you do be done to honor God. And if you do, the rest of it will work itself out. You might be falsely accused. You might be persecuted by the government. But be persecuted because you've done what was right by God, not because you were guilty. We're going to see more of that next week as we get into some of the next verses. But subject yourselves appropriately while living first Christian. Peter concluded these verses by reminding them, honor God, love each other, do what's right, give proper respect. That has got to be our life approach. That has got to be the way that we tackle living in a godless, ungodly world while trying to be godly people. I don't strike first because somebody's going to strike at me. I don't strike back because somebody struck me. I love, strive to forgive, strive to serve where I can serve, show compassion where I can, give help where I can. In all things, I honor God. But that's my approach to every day. How much different of a life am I going to be living? How much better of a life will I be living? We're going to carry on next week. It's going to talk a little bit more about difficult situations. It's going to talk about living as a slave. Probably going to get over into the start of the next chapter where it makes a comparison for wives living with their husbands. Surprisingly, it compares it back to a slave with a master. We'll deal with that next week. See if you come hear what I got to say about that. The passage everybody wants to hear about. The lesson is yours for this morning. We're going to sing number 368. All to Jesus I surrender.